So there's a lot of talk out there about the design process. Agencies and organizations will put up what their unique process is for design, and that includes iteration, ideation, research. There's a lot of these big terms about the major steps of design, and that's fine. That's all great. But there's just not a lot of detail out there about the real, like, sit down and do it level design process. So I want to talk a bit about that and show you through a few examples what that looks like. This is going to be a really quick, very basic view of the process, but I hope to touch on some of the biggest steps and the most important steps so you can get started as you're working on your own project and you're applying this process to your work. So we are always going to start out with a goal. That meaning design's always trying to create some future, some ideal future. Like in this example I'm going to give you, let's build a paper airplane that can carry a penny across the room. Or what about a service that is going to, so guys can get a shave, so they can go somewhere and get a good shave. So flying a penny across the room in a paper airplane and getting a shave. The paper airplane example is one that's could be more of a graphic design type example. The service, we get out of actually designing stuff or designing processes. So I think those are good examples for that. So with each of these, we have to consider there are three main actors. There are people that we've got to consider and we need to know about. There are objects, and sometimes that includes materials and stuff like that. And then there's also context. And that is the place in which this stuff is made or in which this stuff happens. So I've got like my paper airplane example. Now I get to draw a paper airplane, which is going to be a really bad one here. So there's my paper airplane. And then I've got my shave service, well, there we go. Guy with beard, person with beard. There we go. So in each of these, I've got to consider the people. Who are the men that need to get the shave? And we need to know who are they, how much hair do they have, do they like shaving? Is this like just got a regular shave? Is it a fancy shave? So that comes down to who the people are. So when you're designing, you've got to consider who are the people I'm designing for, what do they prefer, what are their needs, what are their challenges, stuff like that. In the paper airplane, it's a little bit less important, but we have to think about who's throwing it, their ability to throw it, different hand sizes, stuff like that. When we get into our example with the object level, so the stuff itself, guys have different faces and different, maybe different sensitive skin. That we think at the object level of the surfaces themselves. Our paper airplane, we're thinking about different types of paper or how heavy the penny is. And then context. So the context for our paper airplane, is it really windy when we throw this? Are we throwing it inside or outside? We need to know that stuff. And then our context for our guy is this a quick shave? Is this a long shave? Is the shave going to be one of these like luxurious, I've got tons of time to be able to do it and I want to enjoy the experience of shaving? Or is it, I just need to get a shave because I've got a meeting coming up or I want to look nice for a date or something, just to give you some basic examples. So with each of those, you still have to consider who are the people, what are the objects, what are the materials, and what is the context? What's the space around it? So these steps are important before we start designing because it will produce constraints for us. In other words, when we sit down and we start drawing stuff or we start picking materials or we start doing research, we have to know what we are limited by, what the constraints are. For example, our shave service, we may find that the guys we're designing for are limited on time. We only have 3 minutes. The service we design has to be done very quickly. Let's say our paper airplane. The constraints are that context is a big constraint. If I'm throwing it outside, then a constraint is I can't use really flimsy material. I got to use something a little stronger, maybe heavier, so it'll fly through the air a lot better. Because outside, the wind's more likely to blow it all over the place. So constraints are really key in these cases. When we start talking about constraints, it does something wonderful for our design process. What it does is it allows us, first off, to know what actually we can do and what we can't do. And it saves us time, saves us wasted time when we are designing. For instance, my paper airplane here. If I have to use materials that are really heavy, then when I'm doing my research on materials, or when I'm looking up stuff on the web to go find out about different papers and stuff like that, I won't look at flimsy tissue paper type stuff. I'm going to look at stuff that's a lot tougher. So notice when we get to the next step of time to do the research, having set those constraints means we're not going to waste our time looking at stuff that doesn't matter. If we're talking about guys and shaves, if we have to have a shave service that takes under 5 minutes, then we're going to save a lot of time designing this thing if we don't put in like all these distinct steps, like a hot towel service that takes 20 minutes. Obviously, it's not going to fit. So constraints are key. So we've started out with, I got to have a goal. I got to figure out who are the people, what are the objects, the materials, and what's the context? What's the space around it? And that includes how much time do I have, or the place like Austin, Texas. And then constraints comes out of that. Now I know what I'm limited by. Now I know the constraints that I can go do my research. So in both of these examples, we have started out with our ideal goal, our pie in the sky cloud here. This is what we want to have: a great shave service, or a paper airplane that will carry a penny. Then we've moved on from our goal to, we figured out who the people are, what their needs are, what their abilities are. We've also talked about the materials of what are going to be possible and likely successful for this design, and all the parts that go into it. And then we've also talked about the context. And that is how much time we have, the place where it happens, stuff like that. What that's done for us is that has given us constraints in which we have to work. Now we know we're not going to go for some materials that just don't make sense. We are working in this space right here for designing. Altogether, this gets us in a really great spot, and that is, I know what I'm trying to achieve, I know what I'm messing with when it comes to people, stuff, and context, and I know where my limitations are. Then when I start to design, when I actually start creating, I know what I'm limited by. The next step before we start creating is research. And we know what we need to look for, and that may include, reading books and stuff like that, going online, and other materials, talking with other people, doing primary research with observations, where we're taking pictures and stuff like that, shooting any video, and as I mentioned before, we're searching online and stuff like that. This can include choosing colors, or choosing images that go into our design, or even materials that it can be made of, and what kind of papers or what kind of other stuff like that. This research also can tell us time. This is a really lousy looking watch right now, but how much time will be involved in doing a service or something like that, or what materials are going to be possible, like will it run on an iPhone or an iPad or Android, other operating systems, etc. So the research phase is going to give us materials that we need, knowledge that we can use to design. It also may change what's important here in the people, objects, and context parts. And this is an important example, though, of yes, we may think we know who the people are, the context is, and what the objects are. After we do research, sometimes it changes, and sometimes that changes constraints. For example, When I'm doing my paper airplane and my design of my paper airplane, I may go, okay, I think I'm going to need cardboard. That's going to be a perfect substance for it. I go do my research. Let's say I go out and I learn about cardboard and how well it flies, watching videos, talking to people who have done it before. And I quickly learn cardboard, while strong, is so thick that it's not a good idea. So that means my material choices are going to get changed. That means my constraints are changed too. Okay, I can't work with any material that's thicker than blank. I got to work with thin material. Another example could be, this typeface I thought was going to be great for this brand actually is really hard to read. I need to make sure I'm only choosing typefaces that are sans serif, that don't have the little feet and stuff on them, but are much cleaner because they read better at distance or in the dark or something like that. So these steps from I have a goal to who are the people, what is the place, how much time do I have, what's the stuff, leads to constraints that takes us to research that may sometimes change those next two steps of the stuff and the constraints themselves. Sometimes it even changes the goal. So after we've gotten to this step, we're ready to start making stuff. But start with these first components. And likely if we've worked together, I've talked a lot about this front end of doing research so we can actually design and not waste our time and actually have a better likelihood of making something that's going to be successful. Okay, so I'm going to make another video and I'm going to talk about the steps of actually working through the process of making stuff now that we have set a goal, we understand the people and the objects, materials, and the context, and now we've got constraints that have led to research. See you then.